So the event today is talking about sort of our understanding of the universe, the solar system, and what it means to be human in the context of all this new knowledge we have about where we are, and perhaps how small we are, and how unique we are, and perhaps how many billions of parallels there might be that we just can't get to. So today we're going to have anthropologists and astronomers talking to us about the intersection of these ideas and thinking about space and who we are. So I'd like to introduce today Joaquin Ruiz. He's the Dean of the College of Science. He's the Director of Biosphere 2. And Joaquin is a geoscientist, and some of his most cited research has to do with being able to find gold more readily. So he's a famous man. So Joaquin, thanks so much for coming and joining us, and we look forward to some introductory remarks.
Well, I welcome all of you here today to the Biosphere 2. And I appreciate the efforts. Regis, thank you so much for doing this. Actually, this presentation, the series of presentations today are all about what the biosphere was created for 25 years ago. The biosphere is quite an amazing operation. When it was created, the engineering of this building was way ahead of its time. The vision of what this building was supposed to be for was way ahead of its time. And it's basically 25 years later that the biosphere is at the nexus of the issues that are mostly affecting our humanity, which are the consequences of us changing the composition of the atmosphere, which in turn is changing our weather, which in turn is going to be changing the way we live. It's quite fundamental. And I appreciate all of you from middle school coming here today and getting to learn what this is all about. But let me just spend 5 minutes telling you a little bit about why the biosphere was actually built. And you'll see how it relates precisely to what you're going to be listening to about today. The biosphere was built about 25 years ago to address two issues. One of them was simply, how on earth does the earth work? Okay. What are the mechanisms by which the atmosphere relates to the oceans and the forests and the deserts? How does all of that control what is, as we know now, maybe wrong, but what we know now, the only planet that's habitable in our universe? We may actually not be that, but at the moment that's what we are because we don't know any better. But the end of it is that the Earth happens to be sitting in a beautiful spot close to a sun that allows for the temperature of the Earth to be such that water is liquid. And by allowing the water to be liquid, it allows for life to flourish. And the oxygen composition of the atmosphere is just the right amount for us to be able to live in as well. So it's like a really fine-tuned machine which requires the atmosphere to have a certain composition, which requires the weather to be certain ways so that we can deliver the water here and there. It's quite an amazing machine. And 25 years ago, very little was known of a field which we now call Earth systems. How does all this stuff work together to give us the totality of what the Earth is about? So the biosphere then was built, and it has an ocean, and it has a rainforest, and it has a desert, and it has all kinds of these things that we call biomes. And the idea was to try to understand how all of these things work together. So that if you put them all in a building and you close the doors, the inside of the building would be controlled the same way that the Earth controls itself. We learned one thing from that experiment, and that is that we have no clue, or not enough, to actually be able to do that experiment. Because in the end, when they closed the doors, a year after they closed the doors, the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere inside the biosphere was too low. And that's because we did not understand how the soils worked. You see, everything is connected. It's quite incredible. So that experiment taught us a lot about how little we actually knew about certain parts of the Earth. The second experiment, or the second idea of the biosphere, was, okay, let's build a building in which we can put all these plants and stuff, and this building will be the equivalent of a building that we'll need to build in Mars or in the moon if we're actually going to be colonizing other planets, right? That's sort of cool too. So a lot of the engineering in this building has to do with what would we have to do if we wanted to colonize Mars. And I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Mars, which is terrific. And one part of that movie is not quite right, and it shows you how detailed things can be. If you remember the guy that's actually growing potatoes, all right, you remember that? Well, that would never have happened because he did not have enough light bulbs. So if you talk to the agronomers, they say he would have needed more light. Those are the kinds of little details that we were trying to figure out here. But guess what got in the way of that second experiment? People. We really did not understand how people would relate to each other when they were stuck in a building for 2.5 years with only them, and they actually all started fighting with each other. So the psychology of the people, how people are going to behave, and how we're going to have to relate to the psychology of people if we're going to have to colonize other planets and have people living in small environments for a long time, is something that NASA is hugely interested in today, because without that part, we won't be able to do it. So there you go. 25 years ago, this thing was built to address issues that are hot-button issues today. How do we actually colonize other planets? What is the psychology of people? How do they actually behave with each other? And secondly, how on earth does the Earth operate so that it controls itself in the exquisite way that it does so that we have a habitable planet? I think a lot of the presentations today are going to be addressing parts of those issues. I think it's going to be a blast, and I hope you enjoy yourselves greatly and learn a lot. And thank you, Regis, again for doing it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joaquin. Before I introduce Regis to introduce the first speaker, I want to give you an update on the program today. I got an email last night at 10:30 from one of our speakers this morning, Dante Loretta, who got held up in Dallas, some travel delays. So this is a gentleman who has designed and launched a spaceship to go to the asteroid Bennu, study it, grab a sample, and bring it back to Earth. Pretty impressive, and we were looking forward to hearing about that, but we'll have to do that another time. And Chris Impey, one of our speakers this afternoon, will give 2 wonderful talks. So thanks for your accommodation of the schedule change. And Regis, please.
We're really delighted to have you here today. My name is Regis Ferrier. I'm an ecologist. I'm a scientist. I study ecosystems, how ecosystems function and how they evolve. I have 2 homes. One is here, the University of Arizona, the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and an international center for interdisciplinary and global environmental studies. So this international center is a partnership with my second home in Paris, a biology department at École Normale Supérieure, which is a major institution, part of Paris Science and Letters University. So this is this whole network that makes this event possible today. For me as an ecologist, and as Dean Ruiz emphasized already, there are things, extraordinary things happening in my science today, in the science of ecology. The first is our ability to recreate ecosystems. Just like what people tried to do here 25 years ago, there is science at the biosphere today that is actually achieving it. We can recreate and study a functional ocean. We can recreate and study functional mountain slopes inside this glass dome. We can recreate and study a functional tropical forest. This is amazing. We have, just like you would do with fish in tank, we're recreating entire ecosystem and not just bacteria in the lab, right? So this is a terrific advance in our science. The other is that we start understanding that these ecosystems could exist somewhere else. right? And we are at the point where we can use what we know of chemistry and of biology and of geoscience to put together virtual reality of what this ecosystem might be. So we build mathematical models, we put these models in the computer, and what we will soon be able to do is basically project here what the ecosystem on another planet might be like, and we could walk around. So this is pretty amazing, and this really brings new questions to any of us in the society. Who are we in the universe? How do we relate to nature, given that we can recreate nature? How do we relate to the universe, given that other nature exists probably somewhere else? Or is it other nature? No, it's the same nature. How do we relate to this nature that is so far away? You know, some years ago, going to Mars was unthinkable. Now, for me as a scientist, as an ecologist, thinking of an ecosystem on Mars, that's my everyday job. It's obvious to me. I mean, that's my hypothesis. That hypothesis is that ecosystems exist somewhere on Mars, probably under the surface, right? So I take it, at this point, I take it for granted. And so the next step is to think even more broadly, right? So how do we as human beings assimilate, incorporate, digest these ideas? It's just not us on Earth. It's us in the universe and connected by science to the universe. So this is why we wanted today to have this mix of astronomers, geoscientists, ecologists, and anthropologists, and philosophers to help us think through these big questions. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Valerie Olson is an assistant professor at the University of California at Irvine. She is an environmental anthropologist, and she studies the notion of systems, how things relate to one another, how we relate to nature, how the whole environment is connected, and actually what does it mean, the term environment? What does the word actually mean when you consider all that I said before? Valerie just published a book, the title of which is Into the Extreme, U.S. Environmental Systems and Politics Beyond Earth. That gives you an idea of how much all that is connected, right? And today, Valerie will tell us about ecosystems as objects of study and collaboration. Lessons from the ethnographic field. Valerie.
All right, so first I want to thank our organizers and hosts. It's an honor to be here to participate in this exciting event and to see members of the community and students as well. So I'm going to talk about some kind of complicated things today, but hang with me because let's try to talk about it in the end. If you have questions, please let me know. For my talk, I am going to talk about ecosystems as Régis described. But I want to move from thinking about them as scientific objects to thinking about them as the products of social practices. So in other words, the things that people do, which are, as we see here in Biosphere 2, changing and experimental. Some of the questions I pose for us today are the kinds of questions that I discuss with scientists and engineers when I study what they do, when I study their activities, and when we work together. These also come from my experience doing socially informed design processes in research, which means these are activities in which scientists, social scientists, and members of the public, including students actually in middle schools, high schools, and college, get together to generate research questions and methods, but also to question the cultural assumptions and social purposes of research, including its concepts and processes. So as Régis said, I'm an environmental anthropologist, so I study how social groups relate to their surroundings in different ways. I'm interested in systems, but not as things that we imagine to pre-exist in the world that already exist, but as things that we conceive of, that we think about and make and understand ourselves to be living in, and which we basically come up with and make and talk about through language, through ideas, and social practices, including law and business and trade. So I came to this interest in systems as sociocultural objects when I began doing fieldwork on human spaceflight systems, and it has continued for me as I've been working on the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem science and restoration after the big oil spill in 2010. And I've recently been given a grant to study how underserved communities in the Santa Ana watershed in Southern California perceive their relationships to water and its governance. Our team is going to try to help engineers and policymakers and community groups to select and evaluate new drought-conscious water projects for their communities. In the language of systems, we're trying to help people rethink the water systems of the future, moving from the building of large-scale water systems to smaller, more locally managed systems. So my fieldwork is full of systems. It's a word people use all the time. We think about it. In fact, sometimes we don't even think about it. This is an effect of this concept's role structuring modern science and social life. So to do my work, I had to become a historian of the system concept as well as an ethnographer of it. So I followed the lead of social theorists like Michel Foucault, who advises us to begin research by imagining that our most favorite universal concepts don't exist, but are brought into being as people work together through social processes to solve particular kinds of social problems and political problems. Please note that this quote actually refers to the invention of the category of madness, for which I substituted system, because that's how I have this up on my wall in my office, and it reminds me to think about all the words we use and think about their histories. Okay, but for those of you trying to research ecological systems today, in today's sometimes difficult context, you might feel you're going mad, so this works. Okay, so system became an established concept in the 17th century in Europe in philosophy and science after problems about how to reconcile ideal astronomical models with actual observations created the need to think about and calculate how things in the universe are interrelated, not just what they are. Since then, Western elites, nations, and empires have naturalized the system concept, and subsequently lots of people now perceive life in systems terms. And it's not just a term that revolutionized the West's scientific understanding of relationality, it's also a tool of social control and organization. We live in systems, we complain about systems, we want better systems, and we try to escape systems. But they are quite literally, as Carolyn Jones, who's an art historian, says, turning inside our modern bodies. So I'm interested in what forms of thought and emotion, what kinds of categories and social practices result from systems work, and which in turn systems work makes. We may need to understand systems better, but we also need a better understanding of what system does as a social technology of reality. So in this part of my quest, I'm inspired by science studies scholar Anne-Marie Mall and how she calls us and invites us to study how scientific practices create new kinds of realities, new ways of thinking about what's real in the world. So these are really remarkable realities, like solar system science and built ecosystems like this one, Biosphere 2, and authoritative ways to understand human relations and relationality at unprecedented scales. So the system concept engendered the ecosystem concept. Ecosystem was a concept invented so people could study and represent energy and material exchange. But ecosystem also became objects of funding and policy and have increasingly become spaces to organize our social lives in. My talk today revolves around some statements and provocations from experts and non-experts who are reflecting on ecosystems in social and cultural terms. Their words bring up questions about the role of system, how it plays as a concept a role in structuring self-perception, how we think about ourselves, how we speak together and organize ourselves as disciplines, how we interact socially, and even forms of social power. throughout this talk, I suggest that trans-terrestrial ecosystem work, so ecosystem work that, as Régis describes, includes the Earth but also the space beyond it, because of its focus on extremely contingent conditions of life and its rarity, might present new opportunities for reflective collaborations between scientists, social scientists, humanities scholars, artists, and members of the public beyond the spheres of science. Once in a while, that kind of broad, wild collaboration happens, but usually the system idea is taken as a given and not really subjected to questions about its conceptual or political nature, as a concept that people use, explicitly or unconsciously, to connect some things, but to also separate others. Given how the system concept focuses on the science and politics of relations, how people relate, how we consider ourselves to be related to other things, I want to follow on some of our discussions here to think about whether extraterrestrial ecosystem science's most important question may not actually be only what is life, but instead what is relationality? What does it mean to be in relations? The lesson that ecosystem science and projects like Biosphere 2 teach us is that you can't just willy-nilly connect and separate. You have to account for everything and think twice about what you think about as connected and what you count or don't count as mattering in a system. The irony about this is, as ecosystem historians like Frank Galli and Peter Anker have shown us, and some field data I'll show you today, ecosystem work as a social process linked to disciplinary standards does lots of conscious and unconscious separating and bracketing out. In addition, ecosystem science's complexity and its scalar complexity and its historical association with elite practices means that ecosystem, unlike the more common word that we're used to, environment, is a concept that can limit collaborations with non-science practitioners. Notice that, unlike the word environment, we don't speak of ecosystem politics, ecosystem justice, or ecosystem racism, even though it might be useful to do so because, unlike environment, ecosystem explicitly connects human and non-human systems. In fact, it reminds us that there are no human systems without other systems. What this all points to is this: how can we think about the relational sociality and politics of ecosystem science in the contemporary environment? In contemporary social environment. Does this matter? These are big questions, and I'm curious about what you think. So let's begin with a few slides from my fields. So this is a comment. When I do my work, I do interviews with people and I observe them at work. And this is a comment from a space life scientist who's also a flight surgeon. That means he takes care of astronauts before, during, and after they fly in space. And he tells us that he learned how to think in systems. But let's think about that carefully, because what he's really telling us, he's giving us a double meaning here. He learned to think in places that we call systems, institutional systems, educational systems. But he also thinks about systems as hyper-natural things and very, very technical things. He is also giving us a sense of his ethics or his morality in this statement as well, about the potential boundarylessness of systems thought, how it makes us think we belong in the universe. Here is a comment made in a diary from an astronaut who lived underwater to do some training in science. And what he's saying is something very charismatic. He's saying to us that when we study Earth from above or below, and we understand it, we can take more care of our precious ecosystems that we live in. But he's also making an argument here in favor of human spaceflight. He's making an analogy. He's comparing underwater to outer space, but he's also making an argument about why spaceflight is important. Astronauts, as post-World War II reorganizations of industrial life happened in terms of systems management and systems engineering, became the ultimate systemic subjects. But this astronaut is also responding emotionally to his feeling about being embedded in socio-natural technical systems, right? Putting all these words together. This is good, but notice the complex setting. He's telling you this from a one-of-a-kind habitat on the seafloor linked to a one-of-a-kind habitat in outer space. These sites are interesting to us, but they also remind us that they're far away from our everyday lives. And so it makes perceiving ecosystems sometimes seem to be something that specialists do best. Now let's go to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so let me contrast the astronaut's passionate statement about systemic belonging with this statement made by a fisherman that I heard at the annual Ecosystem and Oil Spill Conference that's held every year in the Gulf of Mexico after the big oil spill. So the question here was asked very angrily during the annual spill conference. The conference is kind of expensive, so most people can't attend it, but this year, when I heard this statement, there was a publicly open session with a panel of scientists, which turned out to be angry fishing folk confronting scientists. This fisherman indicated that there seemed to be a lot of care for the ecosystem, but not for humans. Also, no one was allowing him to participate in ecosystem science, which was being highly controlled because of legal implications, but also because of the needs of science. When faced with his questions, the scientists on the stage struggled to answer. They talked about human health, but they missed what was at the heart of the question, which is that people might feel excluded from the ecosystem as an object in production in spaces that they may feel excluded from, as if oil people and science people were the owners of the ecosystem. Now, we know that that's not necessarily true, and in places like Biosphere 2 that includes the public, you have a dialogue and engagement, but that's not always the case. Ecosystems are complicated things to think about. And then there's this statement. You see the symbols down there? That was a bad word, so I had to take that out for today. Anyway, so this is a statement I got from a fisheries biologist. So this is a biologist being frustrated about ecosystems. He was in the same conference that I was at with the fishermen. And he was saying he was frustrated because the conference took a traditional format in which every section of the conference was divided. So all the chemists went over here, all the biologists went over here, all the human people went over here, and they stayed away from each other's sessions. And they didn't really learn about the ecosystem as a connected thing, right? So he was really frustrated. And one of the social scientists there said to me, hey, it's crazy that nobody from the natural sciences is attending our human health seminars. Hey, what if next year we raffle off an iPad, right? So it was a way to try to get scientists to go across their boundaries that they have to create for themselves in order to do their careers. Another person at the conference, a community resource organizer, told me about the lack of ways to integrate local experience-based knowledge like that of the fishermen into ecosystem research. He said to me, we probably need an environmental sociologist to help us out. Another scientist, a Mexican biologist that I interviewed coming up from the Yucatan, highlighted another way that ecosystem science isn't necessarily coordinated. He said to me, US scientists don't measure seafood safety for hydrocarbons, which is the toxins coming from the oils, the way that we do. They measure the fish flesh. We measure the organ systems, and we get higher toxicity readings. So I don't know who knows what you're eating up here in the US, right? So they both work in ecosystems, but they think very differently about what counts as how to research them. So systems are systems, but not in the same way to everyone. The system term slips around, unnoticed in our minds and conversations, doing a whole lot of cultural work that goes unconsidered. People deploy it to connect and disconnect, and it's become a modern hegemonic experience. So in my work, I've come to call system a relational technology, meaning that I see it as something, even as an idea, that people use to make things. Spaceflight system building, for example, has had a role connecting space things to the US environment and making ways to think about humans as environmentally systemic. It also has a role in creating new forms of systemic subjectivity that make people imagine themselves not in demographic terms, like saying I'm from Houston, or I'm from Tucson, or I'm a woman, but to think of themselves as generic parts of systems. But there are different kinds of systems, and the work of making and seeing systems requires keeping some things apart and some things in, some things out, some things connected together. So how systems knowledge gets used in the world as a freeing or a connective thing or as a catastrophic and alienating thing depends on how people experience it. The Gulf of Mexico, for example, is becoming politically formalized as an ecosystem as oil industry funding connects industrial, government, and scientific work. This is naturalizing new connections between ecology and economy. Have you guys ever noticed that economy and ecology have the same prefix words? Okay, they're related historically to one another. So this is making new natural connections or naturalizing connections between these things. It's also sorting out who is in and who is out and who gets to decide in whose interests systems are to be understood and managed. So this is what I'm studying. So back to outer space. One of the most stunning results of human spaceflight's coordination of very, very different disciplines is the way that human beings become subsystems of larger technical ecosystems. The International Space System is an ecosystem. It's a built one. On the one hand, the term subsystem seems dehumanizing. On the other, it decenters the human and even the biological from what we imagine to be at the center of an ecosystem. This makes ecosystem relations into a kind of flat thing in which living and non-living is organized together through the flows of chemistry and energy. So this circles us back to astrobiology. If life may not exactly be at the center of ecosystems, what is astrobiology actually studying? Let's talk about that through the ethnographic field. So in 2016, I attended the Contact Conference in Silicon Valley. It's a 20-year-old conference of people, including scientists, science fiction writers, and artists, who get together to imagine how people could and should prepare to relate to other life, like aliens, in the universe, particularly intelligent life. It was started by an anthropologist who used the idea of human-alien encounters to inform his teaching. He actually taught here in Arizona for a while. Many people actually attend the conference are established scientists. I was talking with an astrobiologist there, so a scientist who studies the idea of life elsewhere or the search for life elsewhere. And I asked him a weird question. Anthropologists specialize in weird questions. I said, if you're concerned with finding other biologies defined by their relations with other environments, why isn't that work called astroecology? Chris said he'd never thought about that before because he's a polite person. But also, he mentioned times in which he'd noticed the use of the term, and we were able to discuss the ways in which working with outer space in terms such as biology or ecology are shaped by cultural values and imaginaries, as well as by social organizational processes. So here's an astronaut talking about the fact that in today's world, we think of biology as being the way that we evolve, but actually we also have to think about ourselves as changing and growing and evolving through technology. So in Biosphere 2, I wonder how here in Biosphere 2 and in outer space ecosystem science, it may lead us to ways to thinking about this problem, since it shifts attention to ecosystemic relations in a seriously big scale in which life seems very rare. And I wonder what space ecosystem science can contribute to the way we think about the position of life in systemic relations, because ecosystems work in space requires a self-conscious approach to the complex assemblage of living, non-living, earthly, non-earthly, and technical relations. It has to deal with the question I posed earlier, what are relations of non-life and life, either together or apart? But my conversation with the astrobiologist made it clear that biology as a discipline, whether it's evolutionary or systems biology, privileges life as a unique systemic form. It also reflects an understandably self-interested, biocentric view of ecosystem relations. Although kids in school, like you, are now routinely learning that life is environmentally situated, the study of life itself is still a distinct discipline within institutions. We teach people about life-environment integration, but for the most part, our disciplines are disintegrated into separate domains. Historian of biology Hannah Lendecker reminds us that the everyday politics of social life today are based on the biology of 100 years ago. So today, the everyday politics of social life reflects ecology's secondary position to biology. In institutions, ecology is usually housed as a subfield of biology, even if, as former Biosphere 2 director Travis Huxman told me, because I work with him in my university, some biologists question whether or not it should be the other way around, whether biology should be a subfield of ecology. That question reminds us of the social power of language and disciplinary organization. Does anybody know what this is? Excellent, Australia, right on. Do you know what it is in Australia? Have you seen the picture of it before? You recognize it? Right? Pardon? Yes, do you know what else it's called? That's the English.
I don't remember the
Yes, the indigenous name is Uluru. So on the topic of biocentrism, meaning that we think biology, we think life is at the center of things, it's worth noting at this point that some societies, like the native Australian groups that anthropologist Elizabeth Pavanelli works with, identify themselves as relating to places, to geology, rather than to groups of living beings. They think of themselves related in the first place to places like this. So in that cosmology, there is no life itself. There is just all things, and all things are relations. You could be related to this rock. This has resulted in an Australian Indigenous geopolitics rather than biopolitics, and this connects in an interesting way to space science. Space scientists study systemic relations, like those of weather and geology, that, as we have noted already, are vital even if they're lifeless. But when we classify studies of other planets as planetary science rather than ecosystem science, we are creating an interesting boundary between earthly and extraterrestrial ideas of relationality. If, as Hannah Landecker also notes, biotechnology shifted us from a basic question of what it means to be human to the question of what it means to be biological, then space ecosystem science pushes us further. It rockets us deeper into the question of what it means to be ecological on a biochemical level. So today, specialists in the study of living and non-living things are trying pretty valiantly, as I see it, to coordinate themselves across all kinds of socially defined boundaries, including the political and the spatial, to study the integration of things, in part, paradoxically, by separating things out. And we think about systemic integration, but we practice that in a social world. And as we've seen so far, this is a world of compartmentalized practices and selective inclusion and exclusion. How can terrestrial ecosystem science practitioners focusing on the solar system as the biggest ecosystem call productive attention to these biases and paradoxes in ways that terrestrial ecosystem might not be able to? How can we organize ourselves differently? How can ecosystem scientists inspire science communities, policymakers, and people to being very attentive to the fragility, the extensiveness, and the possibility, not just of life itself, but of relationality itself? So I want to end these speculations up with quoting some words from a science fiction writer, Ursula Le Guin, who recently passed away. In her introduction to The Left Hand of Darkness, she wrote that all fiction is a metaphor, but science fiction specializes in metaphors drawn from great social dominance of our contemporary life, science, all the science and technology. Do you guys know what a metaphor is? What is it? What's a metaphor? Pardon?
example.
Like an example? Mm-hmm. Right? Comparing something. This is like that. Right. But science fiction is doing something a little bit different, okay? She says about science fiction, what it sets it apart from older forms and other forms of fiction seem to be its use of new metaphors. Space travel is one of those metaphors. So is an alternative society, an alternative biology. The future is another. The future in fiction is a metaphor. And she just ends that introduction saying, a metaphor for what? So she's asking you that question. She left us these open questions. So in the context of growing crises about how we can interact as living beings on a planet in a solar system, the search for life is a metaphor. And the system and ecosystem concepts are also metaphors. Maybe one thing they are metaphors for is just relationality as the groundless ground of existence. So, on that kind of metaphysical level, I will leave you with this image of the galaxy. I welcome your questions and thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Valerie. Wonderful. Just one small clarification. You used this intriguing term, trans-terrestrial. I wasn't fully sure.
Yeah, I made it up. Yeah, so I'm trying to sort of point to the idea. So saying trans-terrestrial, meaning The idea of trans, meaning moving across. So the idea of thinking of ecosystem science as having to account for something beyond, either the transfer, the way the trans prefix sort of operates that way, to transfer beyond, the terrestrial. So trying to think about it. So I kind of ran out of ways to describe what this is, right? So I had to make up a term. It may not work, but that was the attempt. Any other questions? All right. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks a lot, you guys.